Hello, welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Bible Study. Today we start the final major section of 2 Corinthians, which consists of the final 4 chapters. Recall that so far in our study of the first 9 chapters, Paul has been in a reconciliation mode with the Corinthian church, following a period of deterioration in that relationship after he wrote 1 Corinthians. Based on the drift in those 9 chapters, things appear to have improved a lot during that period of time in that relationship because proper amends had been done by the church itself and some correction towards the individual who had offended Paul. It appeared in the last 2 chapters in particular that they were focused on getting ready to make the collection for the poor Jewish Christians, what Paul calls ministry to the saints in Judea, before the Macedonians arrived with their funds. So that's where it suddenly dropped off at the end of chapter 9. But I advise you to get ready for a sudden change as we begin our study of chapter 10 and the next 3 chapters after that, because something is badly amiss, and we'll talk more about that after we read it. We'll just read the first 6 verses just to kind of get a flavor, because I want to set all this up. Chapter 10, verses 1 through 6 from the New Revised Standard. I myself, Paul, appeal to you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I, who am humble when face to face with you, but bold towards you when I am away. I ask that when I am present, I need not show boldness by daring to oppose those who think we are acting according to human standards. Indeed, we live as human beings, but we do not wage war according to human standards, for the weapons of our warfare are not merely human, but they have divine power to destroy the strongholds. We destroy arguments and every proud obstacle raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. We are ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. Anyone who has been studying 2 Corinthians as we have can hardly avoid noticing that a major and sudden shift has occurred from the last of chapter 9 to the opening few verses there in chapter 10. There is an abrupt shift in subject, in mode and mood, and the nature of Paul's arguments will also change. Scholars tell us that Paul deals with a single topic in these final 4 chapters, that being the opposition to his ministry and work in Corinth. A new and fierce tension appears to have enveloped Paul's mind, says the late Dr. Ernest Best of Glasgow University. What is going on here, he says. Why has Paul changed? Teaching scholars say that these ideas that he raises here, that Best raises those questions, need our attention before we read the rest of it in order to lay a proper foundation and avoid significant misinterpretation. And that's what I'll do in today's class, is to try to bring the scholarly reviews into focus as to what's going on here in these 4 chapters as an overview. In the first 9 chapters, the Paul/Corinthian relationship seemed to have improved, as I said in the opening, and the church at Corinth had come together to correct the issues which had caused that by punishing the offending member, and they had rallied around Paul's defense, more or less. However, it appears now, the scholars point out, that outsiders slash ministerial outsiders have intruded into Paul's Corinth mission here, and Paul will have none of that. Gleaning from the 4 chapters, scholars speculate it appears that outsiders have challenged Paul's authority by claiming to be on par with him, or by saying that Paul is not a legitimate apostle because of how he became apostle, or that Paul has abandoned the mother faith of Judaism. But before we go deeper, understand that most modern Pauline Bible scholars now believe these 4 final chapters were not in the letter that we call 2 Corinthians and that we've been studying in the first 9 chapters. Moreover, they suggest these 4 chapters were written prior to the letter that we know as 2 Corinthians and were edited into 2 Corinthians at the end rather than the beginning. The original ending of 2 Corinthians letter has likely been cut off here, so we've lost that to history. The late Dr. William Baird of Bright Divinity School and TCU taught that this only makes sense when we consider all of Paul's letters to the Corinthians. We can glean from Paul's genuine letters that he wrote at least 4 letters, Baird says, and most scholars tend to rally around that number, although he adds that there are many scholars who would claim that there's 5 letters or even more. I think it would be helpful for us to kind of review, at least to get a picture of what those 4 letters are. The first letter, in order of their writing, would be called the previous letter, and we learned of that, the existence of that letter back in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 9. That letter occurred prior to the letter that became canon as 1 Corinthians. So that letter's lost to history. It's letter number 1. Letter number 2 is the letter that became canon as 1 Corinthians, and it was written from Ephesus, that is in Turkey. Third letter is the so-called painful, or sometimes referred to as a severe letter, written between those letters that became canon, that is between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. It was written shortly after Paul's quick visit to Corinth when he was attacked by some member and disturbed by what happened. And he wrote a letter. That letter is the third letter in most scholars' numbering. And the fourth letter is a letter called the letter of reconciliation and appreciation. It was written from after Titus had joined Paul at Corinth and given him a report on essentially how the Corinthians had responded to the painful letter. That letter is canoned, that is, that fourth letter is canon as the first 9 chapters of 2 Corinthians. So that's kind of an overview of what the major 4 letters that can kind of be documented of what's said in Paul's writings. Dr. Baird thought that these last 4 chapters, and he taught this, that the 2 Corinthians last 4 chapters come from this third letter, the so-called painful letter, a portion of it anyway. He says that the scholars generally agree that early editors of Paul's letters, where they were editing the letters and putting them together and passing them around among the churches, but prior to them becoming canon, probably made the decision to preserve a portion of that third letter. And they did that by adding it to what becomes the end of the so-called letter of 2 Corinthians, a letter of reconciliation as we find it here. When that was done is not known, but was most likely before the actual canon decision to canon the letters. Several scholars will say, although they don't all agree on that. There is a school of thought that such was done when Paul's letters were being collected and shared among the churches as Paul's letters, not as a New Testament, but as just simply Paul's collection of letters. Why was this done? There is much speculation about that. We do not know. It's lost to history. How much of that letter is preserved here, we don't know. And or if that lost content is even consistent with the rest of Paul's letters. It is clear that it presents what we do have here, though. It's clear that it presents that is what's here in the last 4 chapters of 2 Corinthians, will present a very different Paul and a different message of Paul than what we've seen in 1 and 2 Corinthians. Several scholars suggest it was added most likely because in the early church history, Christians, and in particular the Corinthians, had come to terms with which ministry that they would follow, and they chose Paul's, not the opposition. How do we know that? Because the New Testament doesn't contain their letters. It contains Paul's letters. The so-called, as one scholar puts it, the winner gets to write history. Thus we know which side they selected. Therefore, its being here helps send a message to the opposition that it's Paul's message that the church will follow for anyone who might be riding on the fence and haven't made up their mind yet. Paul opens this section with a new and fierce tension that we do not see elsewhere in Paul's letters. He is not at all in a mood of reconciliation. That's gone. Rather, now he is in a warrior or fighting mode. In some ways, this is more reflective of Old Testament literature than New Testament literature. Some scholars suggest that a clue to who Paul is fighting can be gleaned from these 4 chapters. It's not right here at the beginning, but as we go through these, and they suggest that that's the Judaizers, which Paul doesn't mention here specifically, but he does specifically mention in some of his other letters, Coritnhians, Galatians, and Romans, and so forth, but does not, as I say, does not specifically do it in 2 Corinthians. Whomever it is, the audience knows, and Paul knows, but he didn't specifically identify them. He didn't need to, because he wasn't writing to us. He was writing to them, and they were very well informed of who was causing the problem. These first 6 verses are often used by military chaplains in a combat zone in their homilies to support cruelly necessary in war. Indeed, and I'll quote that from the New Revised Standard with slight modification. Indeed, we live as human beings, insert out of text, or they might say as human soldiers, but do not wage war according to human standards. They are clearly taking Paul's statement here out of context, at least the context he used it in. And I can say personally that such an approach added to my own moral injury from the war. Paul is in no way here supporting war. Instead, Dr. Garland at Baylor and Dr. Paul Sampley at Boston University say it is important for the reader and the church to appreciate that Paul here is using metaphoric language. He is not using this as a Christian approach to humanizing war or supporting war. Many have made the mistake, they say, of cherry picking these single verses out of the sixth that's here and going off on a tangent to use this to support war. Paul is trying here to distinguish himself from any other believer or any other minister, says Dr. Sampley. I quote, in the flesh was in the Greek widely used metaphor at the time for meaning the world, and some translations so note in their Bibles today. The idea here is that as a believer and an apostle, Paul is blessed with the Spirit directly from God through Christ as their agent on earth. Moreover, there is no other here in Corinth but me, is the idea. I alone am God's agent here, Paul is implying. Thus, not all Christians have what I have as an apostle. Paul is distinguishing himself from any other believer or messenger to them. He is not at all in support of warring on the Christians, warring on the Corinthians. Dr. Eugene Boring and the late Dr. Fred Craddock, both disciples, ministers, and Bible scholars at universities, comment that it is Paul's apostleship that is at the center of this debate, not war. His apostleship has been rejected by both opposition, that is, by the traveling ministries that have come through, or missionaries, and some of the Corinthians have accepted it. They have likely not only offered a different gospel message from Paul's, but have degraded and belittled Paul. As we study these final chapters, we will pick up clues to support this position that these two scholars are teaching and others. Clues to what they said and what Paul says about them come in these chapters. From these 6 verses, we can see Paul is ready to defend his ministry and the gospel as he understands it. He is now in the, if you want to use a military analogy, he is now in an offensive mode while in the defense. In other words, his tactic is going to be offense, but he's trying to defend his ministry. But he is not warring with weapons of war as we traditionally think of it, but with words, against false words, says Boring and Craddock, and against false ideas, and especially against false theology. I hope this overview gives you some idea of what we're going to be encountering in these next 4 chapters, and that it's helpful to your Bible study. And hopefully we'll see you next week.